I drank pots and pots and pots and pots of strong black coffee, trying to keep my sleepy soul awake. But the sleepiness still comes along, and when it does, it's fast and strong. I end up with a bad case of the shakes.
Hey, good morning, it's Guido. It's time for Coffee Talk. Grab your mug, get your coffee, and sit back. We're going to go over some news, then we're going to go over some of the specials. I'm going to talk a little bit about a new premium and some of the shenanigans around that one, which is interesting to say the least. And after that, we are going to go over the 10 Commandments of Watt, something I wrote a couple years ago, and we're going to talk about that. That will be more gameplay-oriented advice and news, so let's get to it. All right, what is in the news? Nothing major right now, except that patch 9.20 will be out 28 to 29 August on the RU server, probably the 30th or 31st of August on the North American server. The plan is a day later, so depending on which date it hits, it'll be probably a day later. There are a lot of changes in that. I'm not going to go over that. I've talked a little bit about it in the past, but I'm going to wait till it gets closer here in the next week or so, and then we'll go in depth into what the changes are. But there are multiple and too many to go over right now, and potentially some of those will change. So there's no reason to really get too crazy about it. Just know that it's a pretty massive buff across the board with some targeted nerfs on tanks. What else do we have going on? We've got in the premium shop, the Lorraine 40T is back. So if you want a Lorraine 40T, there's a couple packages, and you can get just the Lorraine itself right there. But sort of more interesting and odd at the same time than that is what you have probably seen, the Prima Victoria, which is a collaboration with, I believe, a Swedish band called Sabaton. Now, I've looked at a couple of their videos, and they're basically a standard Northern European heavy metal band. When I say standard, well, if you follow heavy metal at all, then you kind of understand what I mean. A little bit of interesting English while they sing, a lot of kind of hard driving metal riffs and whatnot, but they have collaborated with Wargaming. Cool and odd and interesting all at the same time, and they have come up with a Swedish tank, because they're Swedish, which is a Centurion 7-1, or sorry, a Centurion 1 essentially, or some kind of combo of Centurion 1, Centurion 7-1 made up tank. And it's got, you can see the paint job on the side, it's got their logo right there. And probably odder than that, at least to me, and I know this has happened in other games in the past, they have a music video that is pretty much for World of Tanks. So I'm going to let you see some of that here. I'm getting this off of Rita's status report. She's got it linked. World of Tanks, I'm sorry, not War Stories. Here it is, Tank Metal Unleashed. So here we go. Let's check this out for just a second. Let's see what we get.
Through the gates of hell, as we make our way to heaven through the Nazi lines.
Through the gates of hell as we make our way to heaven through the Nazi lines. I think you understand where we're going with this. I don't know, let's just fast forward and see what's going on. They're driving and loud and explodey and whatnot. So this has been a success. This kind of thing has been a success with other games. I guess I'm of two minds here. If that's your thing and you like it, then go for it. But at the same time, what's the priority, fellas? And that must have cost you some money to do that. I don't know. Anyway, they seem to be selling a lot of these tanks. I see a lot of them in game, so I don't know much about it. I think it's a standard premium tier 8 tank, not exactly great, not exactly terrible. And maybe that's a good sign because it doesn't appear to be the no weakness front armor kind of tank that they've been putting out. So as far as that goes, good on you, Wargaming. But we're really starting to get into these kind of tanks that are now packaged with other things going on. You know, we've had the enemy tanks that went into the Asian server. We have this Sabaton thing coming in, and I think really the bottom line here is we're going to see a whole bunch more of this kind of thing, not less. And there you have it. let's move on to the next thing. Let's move on to the missions real quick and see where we are with those things. It's good coffee, got hazelnut in it. You gotta love it. Taking a look at the events. Tank Academy roll call is still going on, rolling along till September 1st. So we got quite a ways. You can see that I'm pretty well through this thing. Some of these missions I've done multiple times. This is the one I need to get these tokens right here, the Iron Seal token. And that's for the daily roll call of 10,000 or 20,000 experience. Pretty easy if you burn, as I've said before, some of your reserves. The JPZ 100 is on track. I don't really bother with these too much now because I've unlocked all of them. However, it's a good deal if you're running up the JPZ 100 line right there. So hit that up if you need to. Going over to the missions tab, tank rewards is the big one that's ongoing right now. I've talked about the daily counter, 20,000, 10,000, and the TR First Contact South, which was last week. Actually, I've mixed up the tank rewards 10 and 20 with the events if you go back over here, just so we don't get too confused. The daily roll call is also 10,000 experience earned. So if you knock that one out, then you're also knocking out the tank rewards 10,000 daily. So understand those are actually two separate things with two separate rewards. Then if you go to 20,000 over here on the missions tab under tank rewards, you'll knock out that one as well, and those are daily. So you can see that over here I've got 37 of 150 possible points on tank rewards. First Contact South I am done with. That's 10 of 10. But up here now is the new one, which just started, I believe, on Friday, August 18th through the 25th. Germans push south, and that requires you to be top 3 in damage on your team, and you can do that up to 10 times. You can see that I'm at 9, which, adding all this stuff together, gets me to 37 out of 150. And then there's the standard tank mastery things, which get you bonuses when you do that. I think this is the mastery emblem. If you've ever seen somebody with a little M mastery on the side of their tank, that's the emblem you get from acing that tanker during the tank mastery time. So you can see the 4 tanks there, and then there's 4 tanks there. Usually you'll see 3 tech tree tanks and then usually one pay tank, which I do not see anymore here. So it looks like these are all actually tech tree tanks. There you go. And then the other missions coming down here, I'm not going to get into that. There's, well, reference back to Sabaton and that whole thing. There, you can get a bunch of emblems from them from doing things. You see I've pretty much maxed all this out. So now I have a bunch of Sabaton emblems I can put all over my tanks, which would actually be pretty cool if there were multiple different kinds of bands or things like that. If we're going to get into that, there's a lot of possibilities. Wargaming has to pay people to do it, or they have to pay them, depending on who wants to get what out of it. Anyway, that is available if you need it. And that pretty much wraps up the missions. There's not a whole lot else going on as far as that is. Having a little drink of coffee. And the next thing we're going to talk about is getting into some gameplay stuff. I'm going to talk about my 10 commandments for Watt. So let's get to it. This is an article I wrote about 2 years ago. I called it the 10 Commandments of Watt. It's on a site called Nerd Goblin that I used to write for. It's still out there. I'll put the link to it in the comments down there, or potentially at the end of the video. There's probably about 20 or 30 articles I wrote in there about gameplay for World of Tanks. So if you're interested, dig around in there. I'll show you how to get there, like I said, later on. But this particular one is called the 10 Commandments of Watt, and it was the 10 things that I thought, if you did, were most important to success in a World of Tanks. Now, some of this can be rather arbitrary. It's in no particular order, but these are 10 things that if you do, you will improve and get better at the game. So let's start out with number 1, which is thou shalt do damage. Now that kind of goes without saying, right? The game is a hit point reduction game. The whole point of you existing on the map is to do damage to the enemy, whether you facilitate it or do it directly. Ideally, you do as much directly as you can and facilitate as much directly as you can. When you get into scouts and artillery, sometimes the lines are blurred a little bit. Am I getting stun on the enemy so that the friends of mine can advance? Am I spotting with my scout and not shooting so I can stay hidden and facilitate damage, that kind of thing. But in general, even with these quote-unquote support vehicles, the more damage you can do, the better. And I made a number in my mind, and I believe this is still obviously valid. You should strive to do at least your hit points and damage. That goes down to number 2, which we'll talk about in a moment. Thou shalt strive for 1 kill a game. If you do your hit points and damage, then you have carried your weight, essentially. Does that mean that your team wins if you do your hit points and damage? Not necessarily. You can obviously do much more than your hit points and damage. If you do your hit points and damage at the wrong time, to the wrong tank, in the wrong place, sometimes that can actually be a detriment to your team. You're not in the right place at the right time doing the right damage. But if you're just looking at a number, when you're looking at your stats, look at your average tier, look at your average damage, look at a heavy tank for that tier, and see if you're basically pulling your weight at that tier. Now, it will change if you're primarily a medium driver or a light driver. I understand all that. But if you consider the heavy tank as the baseline, that's worst case hit points wise, try to be doing about the average of a heavy tank at your tier. And you will be well on your way to doing well in this game. Once you get above your damage at your tier, now you're starting to pull extra weight. And that is when you get into the carry area. You start talking about the blues and the light purples and getting into deep purple as you add damage onto that. Number 2, thou shalt strive for 1 kill a game. Going back to the damage discussion, all the caveats apply, the right kill at the right time. But in general, if you can kill 1 tank a game, you're pulling your weight. In fact, your kills per game should be above 1. Anything above 1 then adds you into the carry area. Your kills to death ratio should be around 2 to 1 or higher, so that you're taking down 2 enemies for every time you die. Take a look at your stats on that, and that's what you should be shooting for. Does that mean that just because you have those stats that you're going to have a winning record? Not necessarily. It doesn't automatically follow, but it certainly does help. So try to take out at least 1 tank. It sort of goes without saying, but you'd be surprised. When I started looking at my stats, I figured I probably was killing 3 or 4 tanks every time I died. That's just what I felt like. You usually overestimate what you're doing, and it turns out that I wasn't even coming close to that. Mine is above 2 to 1 kill to death, I believe. It definitely is above 2 to 1, and I do more damage than I take per game, and that's what you should strive to do. If you're doing more damage than you take, killing more enemies than you die, then you are helping your team and potentially moving into the carry area. So remember, thou shalt strive for 1 kill a game. Number 3, thou shalt be aggressive. Note, I don't say thou shalt YOLO or thou shalt throw away your life, because Guido said be aggressive and charge in there. The key to this is you need to position yourself at a place where you can aggressively engage the enemy. Sometimes it's time to camp, sometimes it's time to be a second line sniper, but in all those situations, you need to have your gun in the game. For example, if you start at the very beginning of the game and you go to a place very near cap, and it is a place where you're not going to see a tank until the enemy either wades through you, your guys up front, or you finally move forward halfway through the game, that is not aggression, that's camping. But you may move forward to a spot where you can at least get shots on the enemy without being the guy right up front. Thou shalt be aggressive. You need to learn when it's time to push and advance. You can even be aggressive in defense, falling back and finding places to fire from and then falling back again, as opposed to just simply running away, never to come back again. You need to be aggressive in this game. In general, that's how the game is won. Sometimes defending teams will win, absolutely. But in general, when you see a raffle stomp, a face roll, that is from a hyper-aggressive team that gets an advantage early on your team, more aggressive than your team, and it just starts to steamroll and snowball from there. Thou shalt be aggressive. You need to get out there and start shooting. Number 4, thou shalt stay alive. But Guido, you told me to be aggressive. You told me to get a kill a game. You told me to do my hit points and damage. In order to do that, I'm going to have to expose myself, and sometimes I die. Yes, sort of. In order to make sure that you are at the end of the game and ensuring a win, you have to be alive, right? That's just common sense. So while you're doing the other 3, you need to preserve and conserve hit points. You can be aggressive and conserve hit points if you are careful with your positioning and make good decisions when you start to flex or react to the flow of the battle. The key is to stay alive. You need to have about a 35 to 40% survival rate. That's what you should shoot for. Remember, all these stats that I give you are not ends in themselves. They're means to an end. You're not going to go out there in a game and say, I'm going to survive this so I can increase my survival rate. That's not the point. The point is to play such that you have a 35 to 40% survival rate. There are some players who are better than me with lower than that, not much. And there are some very good players, much better than me, who have a much higher survival rate into the 50% area, which is frankly amazing. But that allows them to be alive longer and to affect the game longer, and since they are good, they have a larger effect on the game. Thou shalt stay alive. Preserve your hit points while being aggressive so that at the end of the game you can help determine whether it's a win, vice being a spectator. Number 5, thou shalt fire early and often. Good players harp on positioning a lot, especially early positioning, and one of the reasons is that early damage is the best damage. As long as you're not trading a bunch of yours to get that, that equals YOLO, and that doesn't help you survive, and it doesn't help you do the other things I've already talked about. But you need to get in position and start firing early. This goes back to my discussion about TDs who camp at cap. While they've got great alpha and can do a good job defensively, if they aren't forward firing early and often, they're not helping their team. And the team typically then starts to lose because as the hit points pile up against them, they can't recover and the snowball effect comes. So you need to position early no matter what tank you're using and fire early and often. Make sure your early positioning decisions allow that. Firing early and often also means that you fire often. I just discussed early, but what does often mean? It means that while you are reloading, you're already looking for your next shot or positioning and moving to the next shot. Obviously, if you're completely defensive, there are things that you have to do to keep yourself alive. But if you're not, you always need to be looking around for the next shot, knowing when to pop out, when to shoot, coming out right before you reloaded and firing. The more you fire, the more chances you have to hit and the more damage you do. Thou shalt fire early and often. Thou shalt aim, number 6. Auto aim is a good tool. It can be used. Snapshots are a good tool and can be used. In general, in this game, if you allow the reticle to settle a little bit and look for weak spots, you're going to do better. Number 2 makes this a little fuzzier. You can push 2 and get away with a lot of those things. But it's going to be a combination of those 3 things. And in general, I would lean further towards aiming for weak spots, even on a snapshot, vice just blasting away at people. The sooner you learn that, the better. You should be looking for around a 70% hit rate with your aiming. Anything less, and you probably have something wrong with the way you're shooting. Anything more, and you're probably being a little too careful and missing shots. If you're shooting early and often, and you're still hitting 80, and you're just that good, good on you, but it should be somewhere around 70%. Thou shalt aim. Number 7, thou shalt flank. 2 kinds of flanks I will talk about, the tactical and the strategic. The tactical is when you're in a scrum with somebody and you're getting around the side of a tank. The strategic is flanking on the map in a larger context. Either one of them is looking to do a number of things: to set up crossfires and to hit weaker armor. In the case of the strategic flank, to get around behind a larger force and pinch them. Basically, if you're just playing punchy face, you're probably doing it wrong. And if you can find an opportunity to get around the side of a tank, to get behind a tank, obviously without trading a bunch of hit points, reference everything we've already talked about before, that's better than simply poking out and playing punchy face. Sometimes you need to take a hit to do that. Trade a little hit points for a position, get in there, get the crossfire going, and kill them. In the strategic sense, always look for an opportunity on the map as a whole to get around behind the enemy, to work the angles on the map, to look for flank shots, to get around to the side of them, to threaten them from a different direction so they have to turn around. Number 7, thou shalt flank. Quit playing punchy face all day. Number 8, thou shalt not overextend. 2 versions of this, like the flank. There's the tactical overextension where you just get in the middle of a bunch of tanks and now you're flanked and getting killed. And there's the strategic overextension where you simply outrun all your friends. You're so far out in front, they jump all over you and kill you. Neither one of them is very good. So make sure when you are being aggressive and all the things you already talked about, flanking and everything else, you are cognizant and careful that you're not overextending. Overextending will be recognized by 4 tanks shooting you in the side and the rear. Make sure that you give yourself an out. Always have an out when you're flanking and being aggressive and moving forward, and be careful not to overextend. Number 9, thou shalt look low and right. It's a map. How do I do all of those things, all those other commandments, the 8 we've talked about, and do them wisely within the match? I need to pay attention to the mini-map and what's going on around me. Take stock of the enemy deployment, the enemy tanks. Take stock of your deployment and your tanks. Once you make a decision, be flexible enough that if it's the wrong decision that you can change it and react to the flow of the battle. Just because it's a good spot usually for you to go to doesn't mean you always go there. Potentially, if you get a weird deployment from your team, you're going to have to get rid of that plan and come up with a new one. Maybe you just have to flow with your team and deal with it. The only way you know that is to look down, right, and look at the map. I can't tell you how many times I've found myself in a bad situation because I haven't been paying attention to the map, and then after I die, I look down and right because my cross-check has failed, and I realize right away that I'm completely overextended. I really blew that. The team did not go where I expected them to, and I did not notice it in time to flex. Once you're a Flaming Hulk, it's too late. Thou shalt look low and right. It's a map. Number 10, and the last one, is thou shalt use terrain. The way the maps are built and the terrain are built, there is a lot of cover and things to use to minimize the direction that the threat comes from, whether it's simply going hull down or whether it's using a building to hide from arty or using ridges to move forward and not be seen. There are too many different type of options in there to talk about, but the point is that you use the terrain to the maximum extent possible. Whenever you can expose as little of your tank as possible, whenever you can move forward and not be spotted, whenever you can get away and not be spotted, these are all things you can do if you understand the terrain and the map. I won't get into the spotting system and cover as far as bushes go. The details of that are all over the place if you want to look at them, and I have other videos where I discuss it. But make sure that thou shalt use terrain is in your cross check while you're doing the other 9 things I just talked about. Well, that's it, the 10 commandments of WOT according to Guido. Thou shalt do damage. Thou shalt strive for 1 kill a game. Thou shalt be aggressive. Do not be a camper. Thou shalt stay alive. If you're not alive, you can't help win the game. Thou shalt fire early and often. Thou shalt aim, for goodness sake. Thou shalt flank strategically and tactically. Thou shalt not overextend. Thou shalt look low and right. It's a map. Thou shalt use terrain. Do all of those things and you will improve your game. All right, everybody. Thanks for coming to Coffee Talk. I'll get to posting this thing, let you guys see this, and we will see you next week.